Today we are making this beautiful spread cloth. Actually, I made it a few days ago, but in this video I will show you exactly how I did that. It all starts with a mark panel. I mark fabric either with, in this case, a chalk marker. And wow, that was fast. Here we go. I am doing these beautiful feathers across the spine. Across the borders. I am using 40 weight polyester thread in gold, a highly contrasting gold. So you're going to see every wiggle and wobble that I make. My quilting's gotten a lot better over the last couple of years, so I felt confident to do this. In most cases, it's going to turn out really cool. In some cases, you'll see I'm a little off on my backtracking, but there's so much going on in this spread cloth that in most cases, you won't even notice it when it's all done. And in some cases where it's really obvious in the end, I'll go back and pick some of those stitches out. I don't pick very much, though. I really hate doing that. So these are beautiful heirloom feathers. They're in the border all around this spread cloth. And I learned this technique from Beth Ann Nemish of White Arbor Quilting. And if you're a quilter and you want to learn how to do this, I highly recommend Beth Ann. She is an amazing quilter and an equally amazing teacher. She right now has a class being February of 2021. She has an awesome class, an online/live class where she gives real-time feedback called Feather Fiesta. It's an awesome class. It was 8 weeks. She posts a video about once a week, and we go over all different kinds of feather techniques, starting with basic feather shape for heirloom feathers, or hump and bump feathers, which they're also called, which is what I'm quilting right now. Also, continuous or long arm feathers. She teaches you how to achieve awesome shapes with that. So if you're interested in learning how to do these, whitearborquilting.com. Beth Ann Nemish is an awesome teacher. So you'll see here that I pressed this spread cloth, and prior to marking it, I pressed it flat, obviously. This is a 32-inch square spread cloth, so it's rather small. And before I marked anything, I folded it and pressed it so that I would have perfectly vertical and horizontal lines, and then lines going from corner to corner in both directions. And that helps me make sure that everything I mark is nice and square and centered. And then when I get to quilting, in those corners, you'll see the diagonal is pressed, and so that helps me figure out where to stop with my feathers. Also, you'll see that in this case, because it's such a highly contrasting thread, I'm only quilting one side of the spine at a time. Even though it's just a single thread, single line spine, I'm only doing one side at a time because crisscrossing over that spine just makes for just messy thread. And I wanted to keep the spine nice and clean so that just looks better. If it were black thread on a black spine, on black thread on black fabric, you wouldn't see a lot of that threadiness, that thread buildup, and I might do both sides at once. But in this case, because I want to keep that spine as clean as possible, I'm only doing one side at a time. It's a little mesmerizing, isn't it? I could watch this for hours. So this time I'm recording a narration after having done the video. I'm actually watching the video as I'm narrating, because even though this video is only about 55 minutes long, it took almost 5 hours to quilt this. And I let the recording just keep going because I didn't want to screw up and have wrong angles or bad lighting. I got it right. I wanted to make sure it stayed right. So it was just one long recording that I then heavily edited to get the 5 hours down to less than 1 hour. But when I quilt that long, I like to have music jamming in the background. And since it's a no-no to have that same music playing on a video, all this copyright stuff, which I am a firm believer of, I'm all for, I didn't want to have to turn off my music to do the recording because that would make for an even longer day of quilting. So I decided this time I'm just going to mute all the background noise and the machine noise while quilting and give you my wonderful voice and some soothing non-copyrighted background music. So I'm going to add that in a little bit. But for now, just these beautiful feathers. I love doing these. Now, this is a tiny little spread cloth with really tiny feathers. But as you all might know, I quilt for hire. This is my job. I do it for an income. And this is one of the few pieces that I create from scratch. This is my quilt, my fabric, that I then sell as a finished piece, which this piece is going to Chico, California. Eleni, if you're watching, thank you for letting me do this for you. It has been a wonderful project. But I also do customer quilts, quilters who piece their quilt tops together and then send them to me to have quilted. So if you are a quilter watching this, know that this kind of feather can be added to a quilt at any price point. In this case, the quilting is rather small. And with the feathers themselves in this border without any background fills behind them, I would call this a mid-level custom. And if you go to my website, www.quiltsbyhannelore.com, you'll see a link in the comments. Go to the eye candy page, and there I have pictures and examples of, several levels of quilting, custom quilting, that is. So entry-level custom quilting I called limited custom, which is very budget friendly. It usually starts at about 3.5 cents a square inch, which for custom I think is very, very competitively priced. But you can do, I can do custom for about a budget of 3.5 cents a square inch, up to 5 cents a square inch is what I call limited custom. Mid-level custom is a little more density, a little more ruler work, maybe some fills behind it. But this piece finished, I would call heirloom custom, which it has the fills in the background. It has an extensive amount of ruler work. It has all different kinds of feathers in quite a tight density. You'll see in the center of this spread cloth, those tiny little feathers are like 1/4 inch density, 1/4 inch. So anyway, just know that if you are looking to have a quilt quilted by me, we can do this kind of feathers at any kind of budget, over and above and edge to edge, kind of. So, so now I'm showing you how I I start these feathers, and it's basically by quilting the spine. I like drawing spines because then, especially in something this small, I don't have to use a ruler. I can do a relatively smooth curve just freehand. But I did draw these spines using a ruler. Again, Beth Ann Amish with White Arbor Quilting has some rulers that are wonderful for doing spines. They're curved rulers. She calls them, I think, lily lines rulers. Again, on her website, whitearborquilting.com, go to her shop and you'll see her ruler selection. I think I own every one of her rulers. They are just amazing. It took a while to learn how to use them effectively because they're just so unique. But once you get the hang of how to use them and where to use them, they are quite wonderful. And I use them as much for marking, as in this case, as I do for quilting. On larger spines and wider borders, I will also use them to quilt the spine. But in something this tiny, I think this border is somewhere between 4 and 5 inches. It's quite small relative to borders. So once the spine is down, I then start with the feathers. Again, one side at a time. Now you saw me pulling on the outside of that. It's a fairly small piece, so when I'm on the outside edge of something, I don't always clamp down the sides. I will just use my hand to kind of stabilize the fabric if needed, but since this is such a narrow border, I left the clamps off because I didn't want to risk having the underside of the clamp hit my ruler base. Underneath this quilt, this fabric, this quilt sandwich, I have the ruler base attached. So there is a flat little about 10-inch square table that the edge clamp can bump into, and that would give a definite wobble, which I don't want. So just to make sure that I don't have that happen, I am electing to not put the clamp down on the side. Now see the flagging, the red fabric on the end, it is flagging a little bit. So you'll see a little later, I think I'm going to put my hand down just to stabilize that and keep it nice and flat. There we go. I have the camera. I use a GoPro camera, and I have it mounted to my handlebars. So the camera is teeny tiny to begin with, and because it's mounted to the handlebar of my machine, I'm kind of looking over it. It's right in front of me, and so you can see on the left side of your screen, that's my iPad. I have it synced to my iPad so I can see what it is that's being recorded, and every now and then I'll glance over and make sure that I'm still not doing anything stupid, like getting my hand in the way. There's a few places where you'll see basically my hand filling up your screen. I've tried to minimize that as much as possible, but it is an oops every now and then. So when I put my hand down like this, I can direct the pressure. I can loosen up on the pressure. It's one of the techniques that Beth Ann teaches. I haven't quite gotten the hang of it. She uses the pressure of her hand to, what's the right word? To direct the movement. That's a little too technical. I am not that technical of a person. The less pressure you put on the fabric, the easier and more fluidly. It moves. But it can also get so fluid that it gets a little out of control. So by adding some pressure to the fabric and basically pinning it to the ruler plate underneath, you can create some drag, and it gives you a little more control over how easily the sewing arm moves. And I've gotten to where I can quilt with just one hand with a reasonable amount of control and use my other hand to direct that pressure. But oh my gosh, it's like rubbing your tummy and patting your head. It takes an extreme, takes me a whole lot more practice to get that down. But the little bit that I have gotten control of that, it is definitely an awesome technique. It's just going to take me a lot more practice to get really good at it. I'm still more comfortable with having both hands on the handlebars. So I've got a ways to go. I'm getting there, but I've got a long ways to go. And doing something like this where the thread is such a high contrast to the background where you can literally see every little mistake and wobble is really excellent practice. So what I just put in my hand is a piece of microfiber cloth. It's not expensive. I actually get a pack of these at the auto parts store. Auto parts stores or hardware stores have the cheapest pricing on a lot of things. You'd be amazed at how many quilty things you can find at auto parts stores and hardware stores at a fraction of the price of buying something at a quilt shop. I'm sorry, I am a big proponent for buying local and supporting local quilt shops. They are amazing people who run those places, but some things like microfiber towels are just, if I can get a pack of 24 for $5 at the auto parts store, I'm not going to pay $25 for one because it has a quilty label on it. So anyway, I digress there. I'm so sorry. Microfiber cloths are excellent for removing lint and especially tailor's chalk, which is what I use for marking on dark fabrics, from fabrics. When the quilt is complete and I'm no longer having to do any quilting, I'll spritz the quilt with some water and then use the microfiber cloth, and it takes every last bit of lint and remaining chalk off the quilt. It is just an excellent, excellent tool. So while I'm quilting, I don't use water because it can, damp fabric and quilting just do not go together. It's just bad on so many levels. So I just use a dry cloth, microfiber cloth, while I'm quilting. But when the quilt is done and off the machine, or even at the end of the day when I know I'm done for the day, I'll spritz the quilt with a little water and rub it with the microfiber cloth, and every bit of that tailor's chalk will come off. It's a wonderful way of removing markings, especially chalk markings. I use chalk on dark fabrics, and I use either the purple air erase pen or the blue water erase pen on white or light fabrics. So that's it for the part of the video that shows me quilting these beautiful feathers in the borders. Next we'll do the feathers in the center there, those big feathers on the arches, and I'll show you how I do those. Oh, no, I'm not done yet. Sorry, got ahead of myself. We get one more. So if you want to keep watching feathers, keep watching. I know it's addicting. I could watch this for hours. But if you're done with the feathers, just fast forward a bit, and the next thing that I do is the feathers on the cat's eyes or ovals in the center of the quilt. I show you how I use a ruler to mark those spines. And then really cool part of showing how, see in the corner there, one set of feathers kind of scoops underneath other feathers. It's kind of a cool technique. It gives a dimensional aspect to a quilt where you have three-dimensional where one set of feathers kind of disappears under another set of feathers. It's really not that hard to quilt. You do have to be extremely accurate in starting and stopping and backtracking, but it is a cool dimension. So it would be a choice of making your feathers really, really tiny to butt up against to each other, or just leave them the same size, which in this case, that's what I chose to do, and have one disappear under the other. These are called curling feathers. They're also can be called Amish curling feathers. And took a while. The key part for quilting, I love Angela Walters' quote. She says, the key to quilting is knowing where you're going. And definitely with these curling feathers, knowing where you're going to be quilting is the key to making these look good. And if you're a quilter and you're just starting out with these, mark them. You can see I started out when I marked this, I started out with one spine that just seemed too boring, too long, not enough movement. And I kind of erased it and went with another spine. But I digress again. Marking. Mark your feathers. You know, in the center, I used a stencil to mark, and there every single feather is marked, which kind of makes it easy. Kind of gives your brain a rest when you're quilting. But I chose not to mark the plumes on these outside feathers because I've gotten pretty good at knowing where I'm going with them. But if you're just starting out with this, mark them. If you don't like how they look, use that microfiber or even spritz them. Erase them and start over. Another cool thing for practicing what you're going to quilt, whether just figuring out what you're going to quilt or just giving yourself a little muscle memory before you actually do quilting, buy a sheet of acrylic. You can get them, they use in picture framing. Any picture framing store sells these. They're sheets of acrylic. You can get them at various sizes, and picture framing stores will have them at all different sizes. You could get one that would fit over this entire 32-inch piece, which sometimes can be helpful. But anyway, sorry, I digress again. Put down a piece of acrylic, get some dry erase markers, and just use the dry erase markers and practice drawing some feathers. If you don't like it, some paper towel, a tissue, some scrap batting, wipe it off, start over. Wipe it off, start over. It's a good way to practice without wasting paper or spending time removing chalk markings. I have several sheets of acrylic. I use them to audition quilting designs, to, get some muscle memory before I start actual quilting. I have large pieces that I will lay on a table and practice drawing out feathers, or on my long arm I have a piece that'll fit in my throat space. So it's only about, I have a 12-inch throat, so it's less, I have an 18-inch throat, so it's a little less than 18 inches because you need to make a little room for the quilting head. But anyway, so I have them in various sizes, and they just wipe off. They are really good tools for teaching yourself how to know where you're going to go with your quilting. Backtracking, that is so hard. You notice I'm going really slow here because I want to make sure the backtracking It's dead on. But I found that the harder you focus on something, the more likely, at least I am, to make a mistake. So a lot of times I just gotta turn my brain off or just, dial it back a notch, because the less I focus on or obsess over getting something right, the less I do that, the more likely I am to get something right. So they look so cool. I love these feathers. And they're all different. That's the cool thing about free motion quilting. That no matter, you might do the same thing 50 times on any one quilt, but they'll all look different because they're free motion. You didn't use a pre-marked anything, well, other than the spine. Okay, so I'm repositioning the quilt, rolling it down a bit. We're going to do that oval, actually the top two ovals next. Notice the pins. I pin based a lot. One of the things that's important, whether you're quilting on a domestic machine or on a long arm, is you want to make sure you don't get ripples or pleats in your backing. And one of the ways is you baste your quilt. If you're not, I've got a huge area there that hasn't been quilted yet. So rather than, well, you can baste that either with stitches. You can do like, drop a stitch every inch or 2 inches or 3 inches or 4 inches, or you can pin baste it, or you can spray baste it. If you're a domestic quilter, spray baste your quilt, then you won't have to worry about the pins. But something this little, I put pins in to make sure that sandwich stays where it's supposed to stay. And I place a pin. I use my hand as a guide. I try to not have any place larger than the size of my hand without a pin, which is pretty big. I mean, that's about 4 or 5 inches. I have big hands. So anyway, onward. So I do the spine first, again, because it's a form of basting. I am making sure that that sandwich stays nice and smooth and where it should be, and I get no ripples or pleats in the back. So I'm going to do my spines first. This ruler is a 20-inch curve, and you'll notice my rulers all look kind of cloudy. That's because I spray the bottom of them with a little temporary adhesive. Same thing that you would use to spray baste your quilt. You can find them in quilt shops. That is something you definitely want to buy in a quilt shop because it is temporary. It will lose its hold eventually on fabric, and it will come off with water. But it is a nice hold, and it works well on these really slippery acrylic rulers. I spray baste a little of it, and you can get it off rubbing alcohol, or in these times of coronavirus, hand sanitizer will be your best friend. You can mark on your rulers with a Sharpie. You can spray baste on your ruler to make them less slippery. And of all the different forms of things you can buy in a quilt shop for making your ruler less slippery, spray basting is my absolute favorite. I've used the all the different tacky things. I've used the tape, the adhesive tape that nurses use. Can't remember the name of it right now, but that's also a really good tool. I use that on my cutting rulers. That works really well. Although anymore, I use the spray based on all my rulers. Anyway, if you don't like it or if it gets too cloudy over time, because it will pick up lint, and the more lint it picks up, the cloudier it gets. Just spritz it with some rubbing alcohol, wipe it off, and you will return to your original ruler. It works beautifully, but that's why my rulers are cloudy. So we got all the spines done. And I try and do as few thread breaks as possible, so I was able to do both those top ovals without breaking any thread. So now this is where those are the feathers that are in the background. They are meant to look like they disappear underneath those feathers on the top. And if you backtrack well and don't cross over any lines, it's a really cool effect. And if you're using, black, if I were using black thread on black fabric, you'd have to be you could be a little less careful. And they're off to the races. This is 4 times normal speed. I didn't want to bore you, so I sped this part up. So that's the part of the feathers that again is on top. Those feathers on the outside are supposed to disappear underneath that little border. Excuse me, hold on a minute. Sorry about that. I didn't want to have to edit my narrative. So you're kind of getting it as it is in one pass. I can't tell you how many hours it takes editing these videos. I mean, the original quilt time, as I said, was 5 hours. So it took an enormous amount of time, well over 5 hours, just to get it to where the video portion was less than an hour. So I'm kind of at the end of my patience. I'm doing one pass with the narrative, and then I'm going to find some music, soothing music to play in the background to go behind the narrative. At least that's the game plan. I haven't done that yet. Anywho, so we're done with the oval feathers. Now we're going to do those stars. And again, see how the star disappears behind the feathers? That's kind of a recurring theme. Well, if you're going to do something in a quilt, do it more than once. Otherwise, if you only do it once, it can kind of be thought of or looked at as it was a mistake. So, and this is a good thing. If you make a mistake, make that mistake more than once, and it wasn't, and then it'll be not a mistake, but a design choice. I love that. Anyway, so along, where the feathers disappear and become 3-dimensional, we're going to do the same thing with the star. It's just going to kind of pop and disappear behind those feathers. The ruler I'm using now, I have a bazillion rulers. Some ladies buy shoes. I buy quilting rulers. I know, I'm a nerd. It's okay. I'm proud of it. Anyway, this is a cool little ruler that has a little wedge on it. And if your hands get tired, especially if you have, if your wrists get tired, sometimes it's easier to switch off. It's kind of like if you're ever on your feet all day and you bring an extra pair of shoes that has a different heel height, it gives your feet a break. You're using different muscles in your hands. It works. And it's the same thing in your wrists. If you have, like I've been using those flat rulers for a long time, so I use those muscles in my wrists. So if I switch to a ruler that has that little hand grip on it, I'm using different muscles in my wrists, and it helps relax. I don't get achy wrists at the end of the day if I use different kinds of rulers. Again, this was a 5 hours of free motion quilting all in one day. That's a lot of wear and tear on your hands, on your back, on your wrists. You know, it's a lot. So one of the things that I found that really helps with not getting fatigued is switching off different kinds of rulers. So in this case, I use this one, Bold Notion Quilting, which is where this one, I got it. They make those. Quilters Apothecary. If you're a quilter and you watch a lot of YouTube videos on quilting, you might be familiar with Jamie Whalen, Whalen. His company name is Quilters Apothecary. All his rulers have that little hand grip on it. So if you're into those, I think this straight ruler by Bold Notion Quilting is the only one I have. None of my curved rulers have that on it, but it's all right. So anyway, if you're quilting a lot, free motion quilting a lot in any one day, and you're starting to feel hand or wrist fatigue, or even shoulder fatigue for that matter, switch off on the kind of ruler that you're using. You'd be amazed at the difference it makes. And for that matter, you know, I was standing for 5 hours. I stand on those, for lack of a better word, those orthopedic mats. You know, those thick mats. I got mine at Costco. They're like $10 a piece. At the end of the season, when they want to get rid of them, they're $10 a piece. Keep an eye on that. They are so worth it. I basically quilt in my bare feet, but if you have issues with standing, I used to do embroidery a lot, and I would have shoes with different heel heights. I would have slippers that were flat. I would switch to tennis shoes, and then I would switch to a pair of shoes with a little bit of a heel on it. And about every hour or so, I would switch shoes to a different heel height. You'd be amazed at how you can minimize how much your feet or even your back for that matter hurt if you just switch off, because you're putting stress on different muscles by doing that. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. You notice that I did the star from the center out. I have found that for me anyway, if I have to nail a point and not miss it, then that's my pivot point. So that's why I did that center that way. And if you also noticed, I did the same number of repeats on every line. So I went from the center out and back, center out and back. So I have two thread lines on every one of those lines. When you're stitching in a high contrast like this, it makes a big difference. You can really see how many layers of thread you're quilting with, or that how many times you went over any one row of thread. What are we doing now? Oh, I'm about to mark the center. I'm going to put some really pretty, really teeny tiny feathers inside those diamonds. So to help me stay accurate, I'm using a chalk pencil to mark the center of the diamonds so that I can line up my feathers consistently. Now these feathers that are coming up are teeny, teeny, tiny. The loops in those are like a 1/4 inch loops. So throughout the rest of the quilt so far, my stitch length has been about 12 stitches per inch. That's my normal, either 12 or 14 stitches per inch is my normal that I quilt with. In this case, it was set at 12 stitches per inch. For these teeny tiny feathers, I'm still using 40 weight thread, but I upped my stitch length, or reduced my stitch length, to 16 stitches per inch. Look how tiny, tiny those feathers are. I wanted something to grab your eye, something that was just a focal point at the center of the spread cloth. And because this thread cloth is basically all one thread color, I thought I would achieve that by changing the density of the stitching drastically. So by making these feathers that much smaller, I changed the density drastically, and that'll become a focal point. That was the game plan anyway. I think it worked. You'll see. This speeds up in a minute, so hang in there. You won't get bored, hopefully. Now I am doing both sides of the feathers, both sides of the spine in one pass here. After I did those first 2 rows and got it established, I figured that there would be a lot less thread buildup if I just did both sides of the spine at once. In a way, that extra backtracking coming down the sides of those diamonds really added to the focalness of this. It's one of the considerations I take in when I quilt, or when I decide on a quilting plan, is my thread path and how much thread accumulation I will get doing, something versus another. So on bigger quilts, it's mostly, how many times do I have to break thread? And if I add another something or other, I can get back, or I can get to where I need to be to continue quilting without having to break thread, which from a customer's perspective, since I charge by the hour, makes a big difference. It takes a few seconds to cut thread and then reestablish, and get going again. Well, you do that 100 times in a given quilt, it can add a couple hours to a quilt. So it's a consideration in pretty much every quilt. So now what I'm doing is I'm adding an echo line outside of these feathers because it wasn't included in the stencil, so I'm doing it pretty much freehand. But that's a dense fill. Those feathers inside the center star is basically a dense fill. So I want to give a border to that because I'm going to do dense fills all throughout that center to give a light and shadow effect with the quilting. So I need something to give a barrier between the sections of fills so that they don't just all run together and become a blurry mess. So that's why I'm echoing these feathers so that they'll be set apart from the next fill that I put in that center area. You'll see when I'm done. But because I didn't mark it, I have to be really careful, so I'm going really slow. But after this, that's about all that's left in this quilt. I'm going to do the cross-hatching inside the cat's eyes and in the outer corners of the center, and then do the dense fill inside this in the center area around the star area. I will be switching to black thread to do the fills, and I'm going to be using a 100 weight black thread. So this is a 40 weight gold thread. I'll be switching to a 100 weight black thread. And by switching, that 100 weight black thread is basically the thickness of your hair. It's very, very thin. Which, oh, a little wobble there. So you can see every little, that's the thing about contrasting thread. Anyway, using a really thin, I think 100 weight is about the thinnest thread there is, at least that I'm familiar with. It gives a lot of texture, and it creates that light and shadow on a quilt. And I'm going to be doing some really dense stitching in the center to go with the really dense feathers in the center. But first we'll do the cross hatching. This is 1/2 inch cross hatching. And I switched to a different ruler for a couple reasons. One, again, to give different muscles in my hands and wrist a break. And this ruler, I think this is by Angela Walters. This is, I think she calls this her slim ruler. Angela Walters is an awesome quilter. I've taken a lot of her online classes. You'll find her on YouTube. Just about all her classes are free, and they are well worth taking. So if you are a quilter and you want to improve your quilting, check out Angela Walters. What's the name of her company? I can't think of it right now. Something about therapy. Quilting is my therapy. I'll think of it. When I stop trying to think of it, it'll come to me. Anyway, the other reason I switch to this ruler, I have several straight edge rulers, but this one has really clear 1/2 inch markings on it. And because this is the bottom of the quilt that rubbed against my belly for during all the others, a lot of my markings have gotten really hard to see. So I chose her ruler because it has really clear 1/2 inch markings on it, and anywhere that I need a little extra help seeing where the line should be, that ruler is going to really do a good job helping me do it. Another tidbit that I'm noticing, notice the size of the ruler. It's basically the length of my hand and the width of just a few fingers. This is a perfect size for a straight ruler, especially if you are quilting on a domestic. You really don't have room for a big-ass ruler. Angela Walters rulers are very much made for both long arm and domestic users. Her rulers are quite compact. They're awesome. And this one, I don't know if you've noticed on maybe the long curvy rulers, but there's a few nicks in some of my rulers. And one of the things about using rulers is you got to have your fingers pressing down right next to where you're quilting, because that ruler can pop up, and if it pops up, if it leaves the surface of the fabric, it's gonna get whacked by your presser foot, and that definitely will take a chip out of your ruler. And if it really gets whacked, you can do some damage to your machine, whether long arm or domestic, and really throw it out of timing. So make sure if you're using a ruler, you always have your fingers right next to where your presser foot is. Otherwise, you're going to do some damage. So now I've upped we're doing some what I call scribble. This is just teeny, teeny, tiny, incredibly teeny, tiny overlapping loops. If you're a quilter and you know about stippling, this is stippling where you're allowed to cross the line. Actually, you're supposed to cross the line. So teeny, teeny, tiny overlapping circles. And stitch length of between 16 and 18. Or just go into manual mode, really fast manual mode. I don't do manual mode. I can't do manual mode. So everything I do is in regulated mode. I use my stitch regulator. So in this case, we're going at about 16 to 18 stitches per inch. And the only tricky thing about this scribbling is to make sure you stay with, you got to color within the lines. Let me put it that way. I think everybody can understand that. Don't cross over that gold stitching. You got to color within the lines. So you don't see it here, but I will do the scribbling all around the outside within those little curved feathers. And now on this inner fill, I'm just going straight lines. Again, about 14 to 16 stitches per inch, still with the 100-weight thread. And I like to do straight lines with a ruler. It's just helps me, again, remember before I talked about putting pressure, creating drag? I create drag and it helps me stop, again, color within the lines. And I can do line fills faster using a ruler than doing them freehand, because the pressure I put on the ruler helps me make sure that I color within the lines being those straight stitch lines of gold thread. So there's the center finished. You can't see the fills because, again, it's such thin thread, but there it is, finished. But you can definitely feel the texture of the fills. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.